welcome to this episode of the Tea in Teaching. This episode is focused on ADA compliance and accessibility. In this episode, our host, Leah Bogan, interviewed Carrie Snyder, the Director of Disability Resource Services. Carrie Snyder joins the Tea in Teaching again as our first repeat guest to give more clarity and background on accessibility and accommodations in higher education. To refresh, she serves Temple University as the Director of Disability Resources and Services after previously working at the University of Albany in New York. Thank you for listening, and please enjoy.
Carrie, welcome back to the Tea in Teaching podcast. It's great to see you again.
It's great to be here again. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so today we'll be talking about ADA compliance and accessibility, which is pretty relevant, especially as the semester comes to a close and faculty are setting up their exams and giving their exams. So I just want to go through some background information first on what the Americans with Disability Act stands for, especially when it comes to online education.
Sure. So just a little bit of background for that. The Americans with Disabilities Act was put into place in 1990. And part of the reasoning behind that is to ensure that people with disabilities had civil rights. Mm-hmm. And for education and even online education, it ensures that students can access their education. Mm-hmm. So the Americans with Disabilities Act defines what disability is, and it talks about anything that substantially limits a major life function. And when we're talking about education, major life functions are things like thinking, learning, concentrating, reading, seeing, hearing. So those are actually defined in the ADA. There's a whole list, but those are the things that we're really thinking about when we're looking at education and the things that will impact a student when they're in the classroom.
Right. No, thank you so much, because a lot of times we do see the acronym ADA and may not really know the background, and especially that you said 1990. I also find that that's interesting, that wasn't that long ago either, also coming at a good time for online education, and I'm sure that there'll continue to be improvements with that. So thank you for walking us through the background a bit. And we talk about accessibility and accommodation a lot, but could you give us the definition and the difference between what those two words mean?
So accessibility is the way in which someone can get to what they need. So how they can get to their education, how they can get into a building. Whereas accommodations are what we do to make something accessible. So I think the best way to describe it is taking it out of the classroom for a minute and talking about getting into a building.
Right.
A building that is accessible is one that everyone can get into. If a building has stairs, it's not necessarily accessible, but we can make it accessible with the accommodation of a ramp.
Right. Interesting. No, thank you for that, because once again, even just seeing the written words, a lot, if you don't have that background, it just kind of all, you're like, oh, it means the same thing, but all these minute differences matter. And I do just want to say, even when I was coming into this office today, I was holding a couple of things, and I tend to hold the door open for myself, but this time I was like, okay, I'm gonna press, the button to open the doors, and I was like, I'm really glad this is here. And that's a small difference that it made for me, but it makes a huge difference for others, and something that I also don't even think about when it comes to accessing a building.
And that actually leads into universal design.
Right.
Ramps, the buttons that open doors, even though they're designed for people with disabilities, they're useful for everybody.
Right.
So someone who has things in their hands. Ramps can be used by not just people with disabilities, but someone who is pushing a stroller, someone who is delivering something to a building. So universal design takes into account not just somebody who has a disability, but everyone.
And I'm so glad you're bringing up universal design, because that is actually something I did want to talk to you about, is universal design for learning principles.
Absolutely.
And I know I'm asking you to give a lot of definitions, but you're an expert in this field. So if you could also, when it comes to online education, talk to us about what UDL is.
UDL is a way that students can access their education, but in a way that it is designed by professors so that it's accessible to everyone. So, for example, we know that people have different ways of learning. Some people learn better visually, some people learn better auditorily, some people learn better tactily or by doing things. So one of the principles of universal design for learning is to design an activity so that it meets the learning needs of all students. So not just giving a lecture, but also having visual aids along with that lecture. And then also having an activity that students can participate in so that they're learning they're doing what they're learning.
Right.
So making sure that people can learn in all manners. And this also assists students with disabilities as well. So you're helping everybody in the classroom in that manner.
No, I love that, and I think that's very important. So talking about using UDL principles and ADA in the classroom, so what can faculty do to remain proactive with their course design, especially instead of being reactive when it comes to using these principles?
That's a great question. I think you need to back up, and as you're designing a course, and we know a lot of faculty are teaching the same courses semester after semester, so as you're getting ready to prepare for the semester, look at the syllabus, look at the activities that you have designed, and think about, how can I ensure that this is going to help all learners? So can I have a lecture here that I'm doing. What kind of visuals can I add to that lecture to help enhance it for visual learners? Are there any hands-on activities that I can add to this lecture to help students better understand? It doesn't have to be anything out of the ordinary. It can be small group discussions. It can be case studies. It can be things that just draw the students in to help them use their thinking to learn the principles that are being discussed.
Right, and as you mentioned before, it's, it ties in with accessibility, but it's just great practices to use in online education in general. So I absolutely love that, and everyone does benefit from using these principles. I also do want to talk about, I support faculty in my day-to-day job, and especially when we have a new course that we're developing, one of the foundational things that we like to do is making sure everything's ADA compliant. So what are kind of ways that faculty can make sure that their content is accessible? What success have you had with helping faculty with this?
That's another great question. One of the easiest things that faculty can do is, as they're designing handouts, PowerPoints, things like that, is using the accessibility checker that is built into Microsoft. It's really easy to do, and that really helps them to find out what might not be accessible in their content.
Right.
Another thing is use captioning. Any videos that you're using, make sure that they're captioned. That not only helps students who may have a hearing disability, but it helps students who have auditory processing disabilities, and it also helps students for whom English isn't their first language.
Right, and I just want to go back with the Microsoft accessibility. I also use that almost every single day. I kind of help faculty check the process, and it is very quick, and I know it's not like the end-all be-all of ensuring that everything's great, but it's a really good starting point that at least everyone can also access and do, which is great. So I know you can do that with Word. I do it a lot with PowerPoint.
Yes.
And then something else I also want to bring up is, especially visually, that there are websites that faculty can go to check the color contrast.
Color contrast is another good one. And also ensuring that the font is a sufficient size. Sometimes faculty try to crowd a lot onto one slide, and then the font gets smaller and smaller and smaller. The more that is crowded onto the slide and the smaller that the font gets, the more difficult it gets for some students. That can be students with visual impairments, that can be students with ADHD. So we want to make sure that the font is larger and that we have less crowded onto slides as well.
Right.
And then the color contrast is another great point. If you're using, for example, yellow and white together, it's going to be very difficult for students to see. So you want to have really great contrast, and there are a lot of great websites that will demonstrate that for you. I tend to just use plain white and black, because that's the best contrast that you can possibly get.
Right.
And then if you want to do some things around the outside that are a little more decorative, that's great. But there are other colors that you can use, and the websites will show you that.
Absolutely, yeah, because you might love hot pink.
Sure.
But using that with yellow
is not going to be great.
It's probably not the best
No.
best thing. But yeah, there are definitely ways that you can be creative and also be accessible. So no, that's great. And can you tell me a time when a professor utilized ADA compliance in their course, maybe for the first time, or is there any time you can think about when it really made a huge impact, or you worked with a student and all these changes were very successful?
So first I want to say that every day professors are using ADA compliance. They are providing students with accommodations, and the impact of that can be seen at commencement.
Oh, wow.
But one specific situation that I found was a student who had recently been diagnosed with vision loss and had not been aware that the office existed. Okay. A professor referred the student to our office, and we were able to connect the student with various types of assistive technology and also work with them to understand that they could use note-taking in the classroom. They could use audio recording in the classroom. They could get the materials from the professor ahead of time, the PowerPoints, so that they could be blown up on their computer, their laptops, so that they could actually see the PowerPoints, because when they were far away on the board, they weren't able to see them. The student went from thinking they were going to have to drop out of college to being able to finish their degree.
That is a success story.
Absolutely.
That's really amazing. And also just that student maybe wasn't aware of your services. I know we talked about this in the previous episode with you, but it is the recommendation that also faculty, when they're talking about their syllabus, do mention DRS and encourage students to reach out if they think it would be useful. And I think that's an important topic to continue to bring up, especially when we talk about ADA. Something else, so you mentioned this one student, and I want to know what your thoughts are on how the number of Temple students with disabilities grew from 50 in 1977 to 3,500 in 2020. And I'm also assuming enrollment takes a factor into that, but what else do you think this is correlated with?
So if you think back to the 70s, mainstreaming was just beginning to be a thing in that time, meaning students with disabilities attending public schools. So there weren't that many students with disabilities graduating from public schools and going to college at that time. The ADA hadn't been passed yet. So students didn't have protections in colleges, and it was really only in the 60s where students with disabilities started protesting for their right to attend classes in colleges with their non-disabled peers. So the 70s were really a time of transition. So students with disabilities, especially physical disabilities, weren't as prevalent on college campuses. Students with invisible disabilities weren't aware that they had rights because the ADA hadn't been passed yet. So it's not surprising to me that the number would have been so low at that point. As disabled activists started getting out there, spreading the word, saying, hey, we have a right to have an education as well. More people were aware that they had that right. And then after the ADA passed in 1990, more people were aware that they had the right. I think DRS is doing a great job of getting the word out. I think professors are doing a great job of getting the word out. So I think it has a lot to do with education laws, both K through 12 and in general. It has a lot to do with disability activists, and I just think it has a lot to do with people being more aware of invisible disabilities being disabilities.
No, just when you said 60s, 70s, I'm also thinking, this is also something that I wish I also learned in my history classes, and also this is something that, I and a lot of other people take for granted and don't really think about accessing education day to day and the struggle that it can be for people. So it's such an important topic, and thank you for explaining, that statistic. And something else I just want to touch on, we're talking about visible and invisible disabilities. And I'm thinking, I'm curious if you think, do you see, that there's a lot of work to be done?
Absolutely.
And I almost feel like it seems that like invisible disabilities is kind of a coming to now almost. So is that kind of your experience with your finding that there's maybe a second or another wave of trying to incorporate, this into online education?
I think there are a lot of, so there's two stigmas with invisible disabilities. There's the non-disabled population not necessarily recognizing that invisible disabilities are disabilities, but then there's people with the invisible disabilities themselves not necessarily knowing that they qualify for services.
Right.
And I was actually in that situation myself as a student in college.
Okay.
I knew I had a chronic illness, and I sat through a midterm that I should not have been at. And when I went to my doctor and said, like, what can I do? Do I have to drop out of college? He said, why haven't you been to Disabled Student Services to register as a student with a disability? And I said, but I don't qualify. And he said, yes, you do. I'll write you a letter. And that's how I got services. And I used services all through my bachelor's, my master's, and my doctorate. But if I hadn't said to my doctor, I struggled through this midterm, do I have to drop out of college? And if he hadn't said, of course not, we can get you services, it never would have occurred to me. So there are so many students who don't think that health conditions qualify as disabilities, or that mental health conditions qualify as disabilities. So we need to get the word out to them and let them know that if you're struggling, our office is there to assist you. And in online learning, it's harder, I think, because in the classroom, professors may see students struggling and may reach out to them. But in online learning, especially asynchronous, it's just a student doesn't do their work, a professor may not know why, or even in synchronous, maybe the student doesn't show up or their camera's off, or you're not getting that same relationship developed that you have in an in-person classroom.
And you also brought up mental health. And, in the beginning of the episode, I was mentioning how the term is coming to a close and final exams. So I can imagine how maybe, I don't know if you would find there's an influx of students reaching out last minute or faculty scrambling. Can you tell us a little bit about what might be going on now?
So this is a really busy time for our office. We do have a lot of students reaching out who had not registered with us previously. Some of them are realizing that finals are coming up and that maybe they have needed accommodations all along and they just haven't gotten to us until now. We're working with them so that they can have accommodations for finals. And we do have professors also who may be reaching out to us to figure out how they can accommodate students for finals.
Right. So that does sound very busy.
It is.
That sounds very busy. And yeah, I hope it goes well with everyone involved. But, hopefully it's something where, faculty and students alike can learn, from what's going on this term and hopefully apply it to the next one, though I'm sure there's always going to be something that does happen to come up. So as we kind of wrap up this episode, what advice would you give to students who rely on DRS services at the university on what to do after they graduate and enter the workforce? Because, Temple, it's a supportive environment. We have all these resources, but then, when graduation day comes, are they kind of just left up to their own devices?
So first of all, career services is wonderful, and we're working with different departments on that right now. We're talking about how students with disabilities can go on interviews, how and when you should disclose that you have a disability if you need accommodations. And there are some students who may never need to disclose that they have a disability. Some students have a visible disability, so that's going to be obvious when they go into the interview. How do you navigate that? And then we can talk about how do you navigate requesting accommodations on the job. So students can go to career services if they're not comfortable or if career services isn't quite sure how to help them through those conversations. They can always come and talk to us. And there's actually a really great service. I've used it myself. It's a website that has wonderful resources, and it's called AskJan, AskJan.org.
Right.
And it has all the resources you could think about. It talks from going to interviews to how to ask for accommodations to what to do if you think you're being discriminated against on the job.
That's very helpful. And yeah, because I can imagine we're kind of in like, a bubble here. Every university has its own bubble, and it's good to know that there is a support network once students leave, and also faculty are aware of that. You mentioned the resource Ask Jan. I also want to mention the resource that our department has, which is the Canvas Accessibility ADA site, which faculty and staff can enroll into. And we cover a lot of these topics. And also I encourage faculty to reach out and look at the DRS website and resources. So thank you so much, Carrie, for being here today. And I hope that we get you back another time.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.